After the Exxon Valdez oil spill way back in 1989, oil companies formed something called the Marine Spill Response Corporation. The idea was to reassure everyone that if another big spill happened anywhere, anytime, the oil companies would be on top of it. They would invest big oil company money into state-of-the-art oil spill response. How's that state-of-the-art oil spill response looking these days? 20 years after the Exxon Valdez supposed wake-up call and the oil companies forming the Marine Spill Response Corporation, the BP oil disaster in the Gulf has showed us just how awesome that big investment in making us feel better has paid off. This week, now, in the wake of the BP oil disaster, oil companies want us to fall for it again. Because the Marine Spill Response Corporation worked out so well, oil companies now say they're going to create another post-disaster, make-us-feel-better oil company-funded, oil company-run outfit. It's called the Marine Well Containment Company, which I'm sure will be totally different from the disastrously pointless Marine Spill Response Corporation, even though it's funded by the same companies for the same purpose, under the same circumstances, with almost exactly the same name. Maybe they'll pick a new font. So that's how the oil industry plans to take care of future underwater oil disasters from now on, the same way they were going to take care of future oil disasters 20 years ago. 3 cheers for business as usual. As for the response to the current oil disaster, the oil industry has that under control, too, including the parts of the response that the oil industry really shouldn't have any control over at all. Like, for instance, the decision about whether or not there should be a temporary ban on deepwater drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. You might remember this judge, Judge Martin Feldman. He's the federal judge who overturned President Obama's first attempt at a 6-month moratorium on deepwater drilling. He's also significantly invested in a money management firm that is the single largest shareholder in a company called BP. This week, Judge Feldman issued an order in which he officially refused to recuse himself from the case, despite his financial interest in BP. And while we're on the subject of oil industry interest, the Associated Press did some digging this week and found tons of it on President Obama's Oil Spill Commission, the one formed to investigate the BP oil disaster. Quote, the oil industry is so thoroughly connected with government and academia that it can be difficult to find prominent people for a commission who have not been touched by oil money. Even lifelong environmentalists are not exempt from that exposure. Oil companies routinely support and work with conservationists on engineering and alternative energy research, despite often being at loggerheads over drilling. Among the specific connections to big oil compiled by the AP, quote, both commission chairmen had stock in BP, as well as broader interests in the oil industry. As for the rest of the members of the Spill Commission, one is Dean of Harvard University's School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, which is a recipient of subcontracts based on a grant awarded by a collaboration of oil and energy companies, including Halliburton and BP. Another is Chancellor of the University of Alaska at Anchorage, which has received money from BP and other oil companies over the years. Another had to sell stock in Transocean and take a leave of absence as a member of the Board of Trustees of the Consortium for Ocean Leadership, which has a contract with Transocean to work in the Gulf. And yet another commissioner, an executive at the National Geographic Society, had to agree not to be involved in finding ads or sponsors from the oil industry for National Geographic magazine in order to serve on the commission, because the oil industry has advertised there in the past. It's not that these affiliations are bad affiliations. It's not that these people are bad people or even the wrong people to be on the commission. It's that the oil industry is the most profitable industry in the history of human enterprise. And as such, it is basically the most influential, too. Even if you look at the huge cost BP has incurred so far in cleaning up the disaster in the Gulf, it reached $4 billion this week. That is still less than a third of BP's profits from last year alone. If you look at all of the oil that has spilled into the Gulf of Mexico so far, as much as 184 million gallons of oil, you should know that all of that oil, everything in total that has spilled into the Gulf so far over this past 100 days, every bit of it represents a quarter of the oil we use in America in one day. As long as we are that dependent on oil, the idea of us extricating anything we do from the influence of that industry is folly. The oil industry is so dominant, it's impossible to extricate it from any part of the cleanup and response process. From the judge who's ruling on whether there should be a moratorium on drilling, to the Spill Commission that's investigating the disaster, to even the lifelong environmentalists who are criticizing the industry, to the best hope for developing spill prevention and response technology, which we clearly don't have right now. None of it is beyond the reach of the oil industry. The oil industry is so dominant, and we can't escape them because we feed them so much because we are so dependent on oil. So the question becomes, how do we reduce our dependence on oil and thereby get the oil companies out of the driver's seat? We do that by a total change in the way that we look at energy, right? How do we accomplish that? We accomplish that by developing a new national energy policy. How do we do that? With a whole new comprehensive energy bill. Except, hey, guess what? The oil industry dominates in Washington as much, if not more so, than it dominates anywhere else. And yesterday, Senate Democrats announced their intention to abandon any effort at passing a comprehensive energy bill this year. If not this year, when? Joining us now is Ezra Klein, staff writer for The Washington Post and MSNBC contributor. Ezra, thanks very much for being here.
Good evening, Rachel.
How is it that even in the middle of this disaster caused directly by oil, how is it that it can't happen this year? What year would be better for this?
Probably no year would be better for it. Look, if you wanted to find a problem that our political system could not solve, here's what you do. You'd create one where all the costs come in the future, where fixing it would require a lot of action in the present, where the people who will hurt the worst are international, and where the way to fix it would be something you call a tax. And that's all what you'd have to do with climate change. And so it isn't there's an easier year. There's no easier year than when there are 60 Democrats sitting around, and now I guess 59. But it isn't clear that our political system is able to handle long-range problems where people aren't feeling the damage today, but would need to make a change today.
But the art of politics is making that possible. If climate change, if the externalities of climate change, if climate change causes externalities, and those are felt by countries that are far away that don't have much political capital in this country, if all of those things are true, don't you just make the urgency of getting off oil something else? Don't you make it, say, a giant environmental catastrophe in the Gulf, which happens to have happened this year? That's the thing that I don't understand, that there's nobody thinking hard enough about this politically to make it possible with what is at hand.
No, I mean, I agree with you on that. But I don't know that a speech could have changed this. I try to think about this a lot, and I don't know that it could have. But what is scary is that we have had the most wonderful warning system, or most terrible warning system you could ever imagine. Last 2 years, we've had a seminar on what happens when there are foreseeable risks that we do nothing to ameliorate. The financial crisis, which we are still paying for, the BP oil spill, which we really have not figured out how to fix, where we cannot turn back the flow of that crude. And we know that global warming is coming, but we haven't quite figured this out. So now we have this commission, and we're worried about the commission. But really what the commission is going to tell us is we should have stopped it beforehand. And so what? We're going to wait for global warming, and then the planet will roast and hundreds of millions will be displaced. Will we form a commission and say back in 2010 we should have done something?
Probably. Yes. Well, Harry Reid, Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, is now promising to introduce some sort of scaled-down energy bill. Do we know what scaled down means in this case? Will there be anything meaningful in this bill?
We don't know much. It's pretty vague right now. We do know it's going to be a lot related to essentially politics around the BP oil spill. Look, when we don't have a price on carbon, what we're left with is attempting to rely on innovation. We need a Bill Gates somewhere sitting in his garage doing for energy what Bill Gates and Steve Jobs did for computers and listening to music while you walk places. And the question of whether or not we get that will be a lot of luck and a lot of questions about the actual technology, but also be about whether or not we fund it. So we do need, if we're not going to be willing to price carbon, we do need to be willing to fund research into energy at a pretty high level, the way we have in the past to create the internet, to help create computers and communication advances. I mean, we have done a lot in this country technologically, and if we can't give this the best shot we can, then we at least need to start getting started on plan B, which is trying to fund these tinkers and these research scientists to figure us a way out of this if we can't do it through our political system.
Are we in a situation, though, where the people are ahead of the politicians on this, where a new energy policy to get us off oil, whether it's motivated by climate change, whether it's motivated by the environmental disaster that is oil, whether it's motivated by geopolitical concerns, whether it's motivated by anything that anybody makes up, isn't it possible that there's more support for that among the people than there is among the politicians, and therefore it would be good politics for Democrats to introduce a good bill anyway, force everybody to go on the record with their votes?
Look, I tend to think that politicians know more about getting reelected than I do, so I take them at their word and at the word of the polling that it isn't. One of the problems in this is that it's a very polarized discussion, right? And people aren't being always told the truth, and you just hear it's a huge tax. And I mean, cap and trade, right? Where it would change things is coal-fired power plants. It would do almost nothing to what we put in our cars in the first 30 or 30 years or so anyway. The big problem right now is coal-fired power plants. They're terrible for the air, too. I mean, there are a host of problems. But it's very, very hard to have a sort of a growing-up conversation in our political system because you got half of the group here running to try to get power from the other half. And in that scenario, you actually need something where the two parties will come together and just say this is above politics. But there's no above politics anymore. There's only politics.
Yeah, as evidenced by the fact that cap and trade is a Republican idea that
right.
John McCain and Sarah Palin ran on, not against, but on, and it's now a Republican death knell, apparently. Ezra Klein, staff writer for The Washington Post, MSNBC contributor. Thanks for sharing some of your Friday with us, Ezra. Good to see you.
Thank you.
So there is a risk in reporting on the U.S. National Air Guitar Championships on any Friday night, or frankly, any night.